Okay, so you know how we as philosophers kind of like we're always pushing the boundaries of thought, right? Like what can we even conceive of what could be possible?
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, one of the coolest tools I think we have is this idea of possible worlds.
Mm-hmm.
It's almost like we can just like mentally explore other realities.
It really is. And what's fascinating is it's not just a kind of idle speculation, right? It's a rigorous framework that's become super central to how we think about really, really fundamental concepts in philosophy.
Well, I don't know about you, but the first time I heard someone talking about possible worlds, I was like, wait, what?
Yay.
Like this is getting a little too sci-fi for me.
Sure.
But this is not some fringe theory. This is a deeply influential idea. And it's actually got really solid grounding, especially with all the work that's been done, and that's laid out in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy.
Yeah.
So consider this your guided tour through the essentials.
Yeah, and I think it's worth noting that philosophers have been kind of circling around these ideas for centuries. Leibniz is a great example.
Yeah.
But the real breakthrough, I think, came in the 1960s.
Okay.
With this evolution of modal logic, which we'll talk about a bit later.
Right. And at its core, this whole idea boils down to a couple deceptively simple questions.
Mm-hmm.
What is a possible world?
Right.
Like, what does that even mean?
Yeah.
And what does it mean for something to exist in one?
Mm-hmm.
So those are the kind of key questions that we're going to be diving into today, exploring the different philosophical answers.
Yeah, and I think this is especially important for philosophers because, as philosophers, we know that these abstract concepts, sometimes they have very, very real consequences for how we approach all kinds of issues.
Absolutely.
I mean, understanding possible worlds, this is vital to how we analyze things like necessity.
Right.
What must be true, what's possible, what could be true.
Absolutely.
The nature of properties themselves, and even those what-if scenarios, right? Counterfactuals.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's start by talking a little bit about the logical roots of possible worlds.
Okay.
Because before we can even get into this whole debate about the metaphysical nature of possible worlds, logicians hit a bit of a wall.
Yeah, they did. And the initial problem, I think, with modal logic, which is the logic of necessity and possibility, was that there was no clear way to define when statements involving necessarily and possibly were true or valid.
Okay.
And this is in contrast to what was already well established as extensional semantics for classical logic, the kind that Tarski pioneered.
Yeah, and extensional semantics might sound super jargony, but it's actually a pretty simple idea.
Right.
The truth of a statement depends just on the truth values of its parts.
Yeah.
And what those parts refer to in the actual world. So, for example, let's say John has two pets.
Okay.
Algal and Basic.
Right.
And they both happen to be dogs.
All right. This is the perfect place to start, I think, to see where things get messy with modality. So let's consider the statement, all John's dogs are mammals.
Right.
That's true in the actual world.
Right.
And since Algal and Basic are his only pets, all John's pets are mammals is also true.
Right.
Same extension in this case. And in extensional logic, you could swap those in other sentences without affecting the truth.
Right. So if we take like a false statement, for example, it is not the case that all John's dogs are mammals. We replace all John's dogs are mammals with all John's pets are mammals.
Right.
The new statement, it is not the case that all John's pets are mammals, is also false.
That's right.
So that makes sense.
Yep.
But here's where things get really interesting when we introduce necessity.
Okay.
So think about the truth statement. Necessarily all John's dogs are mammals.
Right now, if we try that same substitution trick, and we replace all John's dogs are mammals with all John's pets are mammals, we get necessarily all John's pets are mammals.
Right. And as a philosopher, I'm sure you're already thinking, this doesn't sound quite right.
No, it sounds false.
It sounds false.
Yeah, John could very easily have had a parrot.
But like a bird.
Right, a bird or a goldfish or something.
Exactly.
So this modal operator necessarily is creating this context where that simple substitution based on actual world equivalence, it just breaks down.
It breaks down.
It highlights the fact that the meaning or the intention behind dogs and pets, it's different.
Right.
Even if their extension happens to be the same.
Yeah, exactly. And it's not just whole sentences.
Right.
We see this problem arise with predicates, too.
That's right. The things that describe things.
Right. So is a dog and is a pet might apply to the exact same entities in John's house, making them coextensional.
Yeah.
But if we were to embed those in a modal claim, like necessarily Algol is a dog, and swap them to get necessarily Algol is a pet, well,
then the truth values are going to come apart.
They come apart, right? Because Algol might essentially be a dog, but her being a pet is completely contingent on whether John owns her or not.
That's right.
Right. So how do we deal with this?
Right. So how do we, as philosophers of logic, deal with this problem of intentionality?
Right.
And this is where possible world semantics comes in as like this really elegant solution. Okay. Instead of treating these mobile operators as like simple modifiers of sentences, right?
Right.
We reconceptualize them as quantifiers.
Okay.
But quantifiers over this domain of possible worlds.
Okay, so that's a really important shift that we need to unpack. So when we say necessarily and then some statement,
right.
Possible world semantics interprets that as saying that statement is true in every possible world.
Exactly. And conversely, possibly, that statement means that that statement is true in at least one possible world.
Got it. So it's like instead of modifying the sentence itself, we're saying it applies across this whole range of possible worlds.
That's exactly right. And what this reinterpretation does is it elegantly solves this problem of the failure of substitutivity.
Right.
Right. So modal operators, they don't just care about the extensions of parts in our actual world.
Right. They actually are concerned with how those parts behave their extensions across all these different possible worlds.
So it's almost like those modal terms give us this lens to look through onto this whole like landscape of other scenarios.
That's a great way to put it.
And use that to determine whether a claim is true or false.
Yeah. And as the Stanford Encyclopedia points out, I mean, this framework has some really profound applications.
Like what?
Well, for one, it gives us a really nice way to analyze intentions.
Okay.
So take propositions, for example, the very content of our beliefs and statements.
Right.
With possible world semantics, a proposition isn't just this vague mental entity anymore.
Okay.
It's very precisely defined as a function that maps each possible world to a truth value.
Okay, so it's either true or false in each possible world.
Exactly.
Got it.
And similarly, properties, they become functions from worlds to sets of individuals. Who possesses that property in a given world.
Right, and relations follow the same pattern. Okay, so it's almost like it gives us a way to sort of like grab onto these abstract concepts using this idea of possible worlds.
That's right.
But the entry does mention that there's debate over whether these definitions are fine-grained enough.
Right.
Like whether they capture all the subtle distinctions in meaning that we can intuitively recognize.
That's a great point. And some would say that these set theoretic definitions, they might group together propositions or properties that intuitively we think should be distinct.
Right.
But I think the entry makes a good point that even if there are challenges with this coarse-grainedness, this overall strategy of using possible worlds to make sense of intentions is incredibly fruitful.
Yeah, absolutely. And another thing that this framework really helps clarify is the distinction between de re and de do modality.
Right. These Latin terms might sound intimidating, but the distinction itself is super fundamental to a lot of philosophical work.
Absolutely.
Right.
So just break that down for us.
Okay. So a de dicto reading of a modal statement, it concerns the necessity or possibility of the proposition itself.
Okay.
So let's go back to necessarily all dogs are mammals. That's a statement about the relationship between the concept of dog and the concept of mammal.
Right.
It's about the proposition itself.
Right.
But the remodality, which kind of means concerning the thing, it focuses on the necessity or possibility of a specific object having a property.
Okay, so for example.
So if we take Algol, John's dog,
right,
we might say Algol is necessarily a mammal. That's about Algol herself and the property of being a mammal.
Right.
Now, her being John's pet, on the other hand, that's accidental.
Right.
So possible world semantics gives us a really nice way to distinguish these two.
Okay.
So they both involve quantifying over possible worlds.
Right.
But the remodality introduces this extra component of transworld identity.
Right.
The idea that the very same individual can exist in multiple possible worlds and have different properties.
Right, so the same Algol exists in a bunch of different possible worlds. But in some she's a pet and in some she's not.
Exactly.
Okay, so to say de re that Algol is necessarily a dog is to claim that in every possible world where Algol exists, she's a dog.
That's right.
Got it. Okay, so we've got the logical machinery in place now. We've seen how possible worlds provide a framework for understanding modal logic.
Yeah.
They give us tools for analyzing meaning. And they illuminate this crucial distinction between necessity that applies to a proposition versus necessity that applies to an object.
Absolutely.
But now as philosophers, I think we naturally want to ask the big question.
Right.
What are these possible worlds?
Yeah.
Like, what is their nature?
Mm-hmm.
And what does it actually mean to exist in one?
Mm-hmm.
And the Stanford Encyclopedia actually lays out 3 main philosophical conceptions.
That's right. And so here we're moving from the conceptual toolkit of logic, right, to the core of metaphysics.
It's the core of metaphysics.
What is the nature of reality itself?
Yes, or realities.
Or realities. Okay, so what's the first view?
So the first view is concretism, and the most well-known proponent of this view is David Lewis.
Okay, so David Lewis and concretism.
Yeah, and Lewis's view is about as robust as it gets.
Robust and maybe even a little startling.
Some might say startling, yes.
Right.
So Lewis takes the idea of other worlds completely seriously.
Okay.
His basic intuition is that they're not just abstract ideas or mental constructs.
Mm-hmm.
Possible worlds are concrete physical universes.
Okay.
Every bit as real as the one that we experience.
Mm-hmm.
Our actual world
Mm-hmm.
is just the one that we happen to be in.
So when Lewis talks about the actual world, he means like all the stuff that's connected in space and time.
Right, the entirety of spatio-temporally interconnected entities.
And he's saying that there are other possible worlds that are just like that.
That's right. Other maximally inclusive, spatio-temporally connected regions of reality,
Okay.
but with different arrangements of matter and different events unfolding within them. Got it. And what's his actual definition of a possible world?
So his definition is a maximal connected object in space-time.
Okay, break that down a little.
Sure. So connected just means that all of its parts are related by spatiotemporal relations.
Okay.
And maximal means that it's not a proper part of some larger connected whole.
Okay, so it's like the biggest thing that is connected.
That's right. And for Lewis to exist in a world is to simply be a spatiotemporal part of that world.
Right.
And crucially, these different possible worlds, they're entirely separate.
Yeah.
They don't overlap in space or time. And there's absolutely no causal interaction between them.
Got it. And this leads to a pretty interesting view on actuality.
It does. And so for Lewis, there's nothing special about our world.
Okay.
It doesn't have some special property of being actual that other worlds lack.
Mm-hmm.
Instead, actual is an indexical term, kind
Right.
of like here or now.
Mm-hmm.
It just refers to the world that the speaker happens to be in.
Right. So when I'm talking about the actual world, I'm just talking about my world. Yes.
Exactly.
But someone in another possible world would be talking about their world as the actual world.
That's exactly right.
And that leads to a pretty big implication, right?
It does.
All those other worlds out there with their own people and things and whatever else is going on,
Yeah.
they're just as real as we are.
Just as real in the same fundamental sense. And Lewis actually has this term he calls the inhabitants of other possible worlds possibilia.
Possibilia.
Yeah. And from the perspective of someone in another possible world,
Mm-hmm.
we would be among the non-actual possibilia.
Wow. That is wild.
It is pretty wild.
Okay, so now one of the motivations, I think, behind Lewis's concretism is his commitment to what's called modal reductionism.
Right.
So he wants to define modal concepts like necessity and possibility without appealing to any like fundamental modal notions.
Right. And a central component of his theory is counterpart theory.
Okay, so tell us about counterpart theory.
Yeah, so this is really important because if you think about individuals as being kind of world-bound, like totally confined to their own possible world, how can we talk about what Algol might have been like in another world?
Right, because she only exists in this world.
Right.
So how do we even talk about other Algol?
Right. So Lewis's solution is counterpart theory.
Okay.
So an object in one world is a counterpart of an object in another world if it resembles that object to a sufficient degree.
Mm-hmm.
And it's the unique object in that other world that resembles it to that degree.
Okay, so it's the most similar thing to Algol in that other world.
Exactly. So when we say Algol could have been a stray,
Right.
we're not saying that Algol herself exists as a stray in another world.
Mm-hmm.
We're saying that there is a stray in another possible world that's sufficiently similar to Algol,
Okay.
maybe in her appearance or general canine nature.
Right.
And that stray is Algol's counterpart.
Got it.
And this counterpart relation is also how we make sense of essential properties in Lewis's view.
Okay.
So to say that Algol is essentially a dog is to say that all of her counterparts in every possible world are dogs.
Okay. Got it. And what about abstract entities?
Yeah, so for Lewis, even abstract entities like intentions, like propositions, properties, relations, these are all ultimately defined in terms of sets.
Okay.
So a proposition, for example, is just the set of all possible worlds in which that proposition is true.
Got it. Okay. And how does Lewis ensure that he's got enough possible worlds to account for all the possibilities that we can imagine?
So for that, he has this really famous principle called the principle of recombination.
The principle of recombination.
Yeah, and this principle basically says that you can take any collection of spatiotemporal parts from different possible worlds and combine them in basically any way you can imagine to generate a new possible world.
So it's like mix and match.
Exactly. So if in one world there's a talking unicorn and in another world there's a plate of spaghetti.
Okay.
The principle of recombination says that there's a possible world where a talking unicorn is eating spaghetti.
Okay, so anything can coexist with anything else.
That's right.
Okay.
And conversely, anything can fail to coexist with anything else.
Got it. So we've got talking unicorns eating spaghetti.
Yeah.
What else is out there?
I mean, that's the beauty of it, right?
It's limitless.
It paints this picture of this huge, diverse multiverse.
Yeah, absolutely. And that leads to probably the biggest criticism of concretism.
Right.
And that's what's called the incredulous stare, right? This idea that there are countless concrete universes out there, totally disconnected from our own.
Yeah, it's a lot to swallow for some philosophers.
It is. It's a lot.
Yeah.
But Lewis had a response to that.
He did. He famously argued that the theoretical benefits of this view, particularly giving this unified and reductionist account of modality, ultimately justify this pretty radical ontological commitment.
Yeah, it is radical. Okay, so let's move on to the second view then.
All right, so the second view is abstractionism.
Abstractionism.
And this is a fundamentally different intuition about possible worlds.
Okay, so what's the basic idea?
So instead of thinking of possible worlds as these concrete separate realms, abstractionists think of them as abstract entities.
Okay.
So states of affairs, ways things could be, or perhaps sets of propositions.
Okay, so going back to our original thought experiment, an abstractionist might say that the possibility of my coffee being tea is represented by like this abstract description, this state of affairs where everything else is the same, but instead of coffee, there's tea in my cup.
That's exactly right. And these ways that the world could be, these are often understood in terms of propositions. So maybe a possible world is a consistent and complete set of propositions, or a maximal way of describing how things could be.
Okay.
Or it could be seen as a property that the world as a whole could instantiate.
Okay.
And a really influential abstractionist view that the Stanford Encyclopedia talks about is Alvin Plantinga's.
Okay.
And he focuses on these possible states of affairs. So these are abstract intentional entities, like Algol is a golden retriever or John owns a cat.
Okay.
And for Plantinga, some states of affairs are actual, they obtain in our world, but others are non-actual. They don't obtain, but they both exist in this realm of abstracta.
Got it.
And for Plantinga, a possible world is a state of affairs that's both possible, meaning it could obtain, and total, meaning it includes every relevant detail. It settles all possibilities.
So it's a complete description of a way that things could be.
Exactly.
Got it.
And the actual world is just the possible world, the total state of affairs that happens to obtain.
Okay, so it's the one that's actually real.
That's right.
Okay. And how does existence work in this view?
So existence is defined a bit differently than in concretism.
Okay.
For an individual to exist in a possible world, that world has to include the state of affairs of that individual existing.
Okay.
So this is really important because it allows for trans-world identity. So the very same individual, like Algol, can be part of multiple different possible worlds and have different properties in each.
Right. So we don't need counterparts here.
No need for counterparts.
Okay. Now, a really key difference, I think, for philosophers is that abstractionism doesn't usually offer a reductive analysis of modality.
That's right.
Like possible worlds are defined using modal terms.
Yeah, like possible state of affairs.
Right, could obtain.
Exactly.
So it's not like we're getting rid of modality altogether.
No.
We're just sort of grounding it in these abstract entities.
That's right. And I think this is also reflected in the different methodological approaches.
Okay.
So concretists, they often want to define intentions, like properties, extensionally in terms of sets of worlds or individuals in those worlds.
Right.
But abstractionists, they often think that we have a prior pre-theoretic grasp of these intentional entities that can't be reduced to these sets.
Okay, so they're more fundamental in a way.
Yeah, exactly. And when it comes to actuality, abstractionists generally think that it's a real property.
Okay.
The actual world is the one that actually obtains. And this leads to a position called actualism.
Actualism.
Which is the thesis that everything that exists is actual.
Okay, so that creates a little bit of a tension with standard possible world semantics.
It does.
Because it seems like possible world semantics implies that there's this stuff that exists in other worlds, but not in ours.
Right. There could be these mere possibilia.
Right.
And abstractionists have a couple of different strategies to deal with this.
Okay.
So there are trace actualists.
Trace actualists? Okay.
And they try to find actually existing entities that can represent these possibilias.
Okay.
So one version is new actualism, where individuals are necessarily existing beings.
Okay.
But their concrete instantiation is contingent.
Okay.
And then there's Hickseatism, which introduces this concept of haesites, which is just the property of being that specific individual, a kind of bare identity. And those exist necessarily.
Okay.
And they can be used to identify individuals across possible worlds.
Got it. And then there are no trace actualists.
Right. The no trace are strict actualists. And they say there's no metaphysical trace of non-actual individuals in the actual world.
So they just don't exist.
Right. And that can lead to some challenges in making sense of how we talk about modality.
Right. Because it seems like we're talking about things that don't exist.
Exactly.
Okay, so let's move on to the final view.
All right. So the final view is combinatorialism.
Combinatorialism.
Okay. And here, the basic idea is that possible worlds are generated by recombining or rearranging the fundamental metaphysical simples that exist in the actual world.
Okay.
So it's basic objects and universals.
So it's like we take the building blocks of our world and we just rearrange them.
That's the idea. And these different combinations, these are the other possible worlds.
Okay, so let's talk about the building blocks a little bit.
Right. So the basic ontology typically includes particulars, which are individual objects.
Right.
Universals, which are properties and relations.
Okay.
And facts, which can be either atomic, involving a single particular and a single universal,
right,
or molecular, which are composed of multiple atomic facts.
Got it. And one prominent combinatorialist is Armstrong.
That's right.
And he has this interesting view.
He actually suggests a factualist view.
A factualist view.
Where facts are the most fundamental things.
Okay.
And particulars and universals are just aspects of facts.
Okay.
And he also distinguishes between thin particulars.
Thin particulars, okay.
Which are just bare individuals considered apart from their properties. And thick particulars, which include their essential properties.
Got it. Okay, so now combinatorialism also recognizes that there are both simple and complex objects and universals.
That's right.
So what's an example of a complex universal?
So a good example is a structural universal.
Structural universal.
Okay. And this is a property that's exemplified by a complex object, and it's determined by the universals of its parts.
Okay.
And the relations that hold between them.
So like our water molecule.
Perfect example.
Right.
So the property of being water, that's a structural universal that depends on hydrogen atoms and oxygen atoms.
Right.
And the specific way that they're bonded together.
Okay, so now this idea of recombination.
Yeah.
This is like super central to combinatorialism.
It's the core idea.
So how does that work?
So a possible world, from a combinatorialist perspective, is just a different way that the actual world's fundamental building blocks, so its simple particulars and universals, could have been combined to form states of affairs.
Okay, but it's not any combination.
Right.
Yeah.
Combinatorialism isn't committed to the idea that absolutely any combination is possible.
Okay.
It has to account for logical impossibilities.
Right.
Like a single object having two contradictory properties.
Right, right. You can't have a square circle.
Exactly.
Okay.
It also has to grapple with these structural states of affairs, which often depend not just on the presence of their parts, but also on the absence of certain spoilers.
Spoilers.
Yeah, so these are other states of affairs that would prevent the structural state from obtaining.
Okay.
So this often leads to combinatorialists proposing a totality state of affairs.
A totality state of affairs.
For each world. And this just specifies all the atomic facts that obtain in that world.
Got it. Okay, so then a combinatorial possible world is a particular recombination of the actual simple atomic facts
Right.
plus this totality fact.
Exactly.
And existence in that world is defined in terms of being one of those simple states of affairs.
Right, or being a constituent of one of those states.
Or being built up from things that fundamentally exist in that world.
That's right.
Okay, so now combinatorialism wants to give us this picture of necessities and impossibilities without appealing to any fundamental modality.
Right.
So how do they do that?
So, for example, analytic necessities,
Okay.
like a square circle being impossible.
Right.
These might be grounded in the meaning of the universals themselves.
Okay.
And emergent necessities could come from structural properties and the absence of relevant spoilers.
Okay.
But one challenge for combinatorialism is essential properties.
Okay.
The properties that an object couldn't possibly lack. This is hard to make sense of when we're talking about simple particulars and universals.
Right, because they're just the building blocks.
That's
They don't have
absurd.
any more fundamental parts to them.
Right. But as we talked about before, counterpart theory is sometimes invoked here.
Right, to deal with those thick particulars.
That's right.
Okay. And another interesting thing about combinatorialism is how it deals with this idea of fewer things or other things existing in other worlds.
Yeah.
So it can handle worlds with fewer complex entities pretty easily.
Mm-hmm.
Like maybe water molecules never formed in some world.
Right.
But it has a harder time explaining the possibility of fundamentally different simple particulars or universals.
Right. So things that just aren't in our world at all.
Right.
Yeah, that's definitely a challenge for combinatorialism.
Okay. So some versions try to address this,
They do.
but it's still a point of debate.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay, so combinatorialism gives us this really neat picture of possible worlds.
It does.
Right, it's very ontologically parsimonious.
Mm-hmm.
It's trying to build up possibility from the stuff in our own.